Okay, so I wanted to make a quick video here on how you can make a Yokomo YZ10 Works model jump better. There's actually a question about this that I saw on Facebook today in the Vintage Yokomo group, and I figured I'd just make a video just to have a sort of a lasting reference for this. There are essentially three things you need to do, and this applies in particular to the 93 Works model. So I'm going to go over them. First thing you need to do, the most straightforward thing, is change the bumper. Okay, so the thing is with the YZ10 models, especially the ones based on the 870C platform, you'll tend to see two different types of front bumpers. There's this type of bumper here, wherein the leading edge of the bumper runs very, very close to the front bulkhead and is also behind the front of the front wheels. Okay. And then the other type of bumper you'll tend to get, it looks exactly the same as this, except the mounting point is a little bit further back, and that pushes the bumper forward. And essentially that pushes the bumper ahead of the front wheels. Okay? So what ends up happening is if the bumper is too far forward, and I've covered this in other videos as well, is that it changes your approach angle to the jump. So if you have a sharp jump face, and the bumper is too far forward, the bumper is going to drag on the jump face. And when you take off from that jump, that's generally going to make the car nosedive as you go through the air. If you can push that bumper back, then the bumper's not dragging on the jump face, and you know the first thing to hit that jump face is the wheels, and so you're going to be able to approach that jump much better. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, this has to do a bit with the landing performance, and that's essentially how you mount the rear hub carriers here. Now, it's a little bit hard to see the rear hub carriers on this, so let me see if yeah, alright, anyway, these rear hub carriers, you can go and look at some of my other Yokomo videos to see what they look like. They essentially have two mounting points for the hinge pin at the bottom. There's a lower hole and an upper hole. Now, if you mount the hinge pin on the upper hole, so that pushes the entire hub carrier down, then that essentially gives you effectively more rear droop, because that's going to push the entire wheel down. Okay, which means that at full droop, you have more height here between the rear chassis and the ground. So that's going to give you more compression of the suspension before the chassis bottoms out and hits the ground. When the chassis hits the ground, it's going to bounce off the track surface, and you have to wait for the chassis to settle again before you can take off. So generally, it's when you want better landing performance, you want more droop, so that the suspension can actually absorb the energy of the landing before you take off. You're especially going to want to do that if you have larger jumps. If you have smaller jumps, you don't have to really worry about that. Now, the caveat here is that when you change the mounting position of that rear hub carrier, you're also changing the roll center, because the outer camber link only mounts onto one point on that hub carrier. So if you move this hub carrier up or down, it's going to change the roll center. So if you mount, for instance, that hinge pin on the upper hole, which pushes the wheels down, that's going to drop the rear roll center. Okay, so if you're running on a high grip track, that's going to slow you down in the corners. You generally want a higher roll center if you're running on a high grip track, because that makes the car change direction more quickly. But if you have a high grip track with big jumps, then you have to make your compromise between roll center and jumping and landing performance, essentially. Okay, now if you have the if you want to make modifications to your rear shock tower, you can compensate for this in some way. So for instance, you see here, these two mounting holes are what comes standard on the 93 Works, and if you really wanted to, actually you probably couldn't, you would think, okay, maybe you can drill another hole into the shock tower a little bit further down to compensate for the roll center change on the outside hub carrier, but any lower than these two holes and you start to run into the actual mounting point on the rear bulkhead here, where the shock tower mounts onto the rear bulkhead. So maybe you can still do that if you want to drill through the bulkhead, but generally you're kind of fixed in terms of your roll center options. Another option would be if you can get some kind of a plate here, like if you look, for instance, on the 93 WCS, that had an actual plate that went between the bulkhead cap and the bulkhead, so that instead of the inner camber leg mounting on the tower, it mounted on a vertical plate, and you could, you know, change the vertical positioning of that camber leg mounter, that bolt set with spacers. Okay, so anyway, on the rear, move the hub carrier down. It'll give you more ride height, essentially, at full droop. Now, the other thing you want to do, and again, this is specific to the 93 Works, would be to remove the torque rod set, or the torque rod unit. Now, the reason why the torque rod existed on the 93 Works, and, you know, in case you guys don't remember, it was essentially this carbon fiber or graphite plate that ran across the steering brace here, and it had these two little things that came out, and two turnbuckles, one on each side, that went from that torque rod stay to that ball stud there that you see on the caster block. Okay, and the whole point of that torque rod was to prevent flex, forward and backward flex on this caster block, and as the car is moving around and going off of bumps or whatever, that caster block can flex forward and backward a little bit. The point of the torque rod stay was to make the caster more fixed, so that you have a constant steering geometry no matter what the car is doing. And, you know, for instance, on earlier Works models, like this is the 92 Works, for example, it didn't have a torque rod unit at all. Okay, that was specific to the 93. Now, the problem with that unit is that because you had these turnbuckles that extended from the torque rod stay to that ball stud that's on the little ear there on the caster block, if those turnbuckles are just a little bit too long or a little bit too short, it would cause bind in the suspension travel. So you would have to, you know, set up the turnbuckle length on that torque rod with the shocks off, so you can make sure the suspension is moving freely throughout the entire range. And what you end up finding is that the correct length for that torque rod actually ends up limiting droop. So if you run that torque rod in a way so that you get nice free suspension travel over the entire travel, you're going to have to sacrifice a little bit of front droop. So if you take that torque rod off, you don't have that limitation, and you can end up with a little bit more front droop, which, just like the rear, gives you better jumping and landing performance. Okay, so those are, you know, in addition to the usual sort of tuning fixes you would make regarding like the spring rate and the, you know, shock oil and the pistons and all the rest of it. These are specific geometric changes you can make to the car to give it more droop and to give you a better approach angle on jumps, and that should make it perform much better. Now, I tried all three of those things on this 93 Works, and, you know, I do, because I don't live near a racetrack, but, you know, I have my front driveway, which I can sort of test things out a little bit, and there's a curb at the end of the driveway with a nice lip where I can try to test jumping performance, and that lip is sharp. And so I noticed, like when I moved this bumper back with the new bumper, and when I changed the droop, you know, front and rear, that this has much better jumping and landing performance when I make those three changes to this car. Okay, so if you're having trouble with your 93 Works, give that a try, and you'll very likely notice a difference. Okay, thanks for watching.